I wasn't killed by age. I was killed by a family dinner. And the killer was my grandson, a fork in one hand and a phone in the other. "You're good for nothing," he told me. And the silence that followed was my death certificate. I didn't cry, of course. I poured myself more wine, made a mental note of the insult, and that very night I began to plan my resurrection. I've always said family is like gazpacho. Let it sit, and in the end the oil floats to the top and you see who's who. And that night, while the smell of roast chicken rose from the oven and my grandson Martin poked at his phone with his thumb, I could already feel the oil starting to separate from the water. I had just turned 70, though if I went by my joints, I'd say 82. I'd lived alone for 6 years, since my husband Damian, the man of few words and pockets always full of screws, decided to die on a Tuesday, right before Quentam started. Since then, my house had been my little kingdom, everything in its place, everything with its story. The hallway clock still read 4:45, the time of his last coffee. No one dared change the battery. That night was special. At least, that's what I believed. I'd prepared a Sunday dinner with the silly hope that, for once, they wouldn't argue. I made my croquettes, the ones that require patience and a firm wrist, the lifelong kind. My eldest son, Julian, arrived with his wife, Clara, and a bottle of very expensive wine that we later learned was on sale. My daughter, Anna, came with her husband and a face like thunder. And behind them, like a whirlwind in new sneakers, came Martin, my grandson, freshly 20, the boy who in my mind was still 8 and playing with toy cars in the hallway. "Grandma, do you have Wi-Fi here, or is this Jurassic territory?" he asked without saying hello. I smiled at him, because I'm not the type to waste saliva on cheap irony. "There are croquettes," I replied, "and if you behave, there's dessert too." He laughed without looking at me. He sat down and kept scrolling on his phone. I told myself, "Patience, Teresa, patience. It's another generation." Dinner started well, or so it seemed. Full glasses, hot plates, polite conversation. But with families, you know, all it takes is someone to mention inheritance, and the air turns to knives. And it was my son Julian who dropped it, just like that, as if tossing a stone into a lake. "Mom, we've been talking with Anna, and we think you should start thinking about your future." Your future. What a polite way to say your ending. "My future?" I repeated, cutting the bread. "Well, I hope it doesn't depend on you, because then it'll be short." They laughed, awkwardly. Clara chimed in, with her yoga teacher voice. "We don't mean it badly, Teresa. It's just living alone at your age, and with the forgetfulness you sometimes have." I looked at her. "Clara, I forget names, not intentions. Don't confuse things." A brief silence fell, the kind that lasts centuries in memory. Anna, my daughter, decided to break it. "Mom, we don't want to argue. We just think a care home would be best, a good one. With a garden, activities, and no croquettes, I suppose," I said. Martin lifted his eyes from the phone. For the first time that night, he looked at me, and his face held no affection, no patience, no respect, only annoyance. "Grandma, you don't get that you can't manage anymore. You're good for nothing like this." The sentence fell like a stone. Even the hallway clock didn't dare keep ticking. My fingers trembled, but not from sadness contained rage. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I poured myself a little more wine. I looked at Martin calmly, the way you look at a stranger who steps on your soul, and I told him slowly, word by word, "I'll raise a glass to the day you miss me." I lifted my outiment glass. No one toasted with me. In that moment, I understood something I should have learned years ago. There's no age required to turn invisible. All it takes is your family writing you off. Dinner ended in murmurs, scraping plates, and fake kisses. My son whispered in my ear, "Don't mind what he said, he's just stressed." I smiled, but in my head another machine was already whirring. Pride wounded. Dignity kept like the last clean garment. When they left, the silence hugged me like a heavy coat. I looked over the table. Crumbs, crumpled napkins, empty glasses. The clock still read 4:45. You got stuck in time too, Damian, I said to the air. I sat down and took the blue notebook from the drawer. On the cover, in my handwriting, it read, Plan B, in case they take me for a fool. I'd started it years earlier, after my husband died. It was my notebook of absurd ideas, trips I never took, recipes I never tried, phrases I'd have liked to say and didn't. But that night, for the first time, I found a real purpose for it. I wrote the date and a sentence. My grandson yelled that I'm good for nothing. So, I'm going to be good for something real. I closed the notebook, stroked it, and felt that strange blend of sadness and excitement that only appears when you decide to start over, even after 70. The next day, while I had breakfast with the radio on, I heard an old Serrat song. Today can be a great day, think of it that way. And I thought, I will, Serrat, but mine will be a great day. For others. I called my old friend Ramon, the retired notary from the neighborhood. Teresa, what a miracle, he said. Still alive? For now, yes. But don't say it too loudly. I'm thinking of dying for a bit. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. You can't plan that, woman. I can, and I need your help. That very morning I took a suitcase out of the closet. Not a big one, the kind that doesn't make noise when you drag it. I put in a couple of dresses, a notebook, and the wedding photo that had sat on the dresser for 50 years. When you decide to fake your own death, first thing you pack is dignity. Before leaving, I stopped in front of the mirror. I looked at myself without filters, wrinkles and all, and thought, look at you, Teresa, 70 and still a spark. If they're going to write you off as dead, at least do it with style. I grabbed my keys and went down the stairs slowly. There was funeral home advertising in the mailbox. Ironies of fate. Out on the street, I took a deep breath. It was Monday, 9 in the morning. The neighbors greeted me without suspecting a thing. Off to the market, Teresa? Yes, I said. To buy time. And as I walked, I felt a rare, new energy. Not youth, something better. The feeling of holding a secret. I reached Ramon's office, an old building that smelled of paper and reheated coffee. He received me in his office, with his eternally crooked tie. What are you plotting, Teresa? He asked. A game, one you only win after they've written you off. I told him everything. The insult, the dinner, the inheritance, the fatigue of being treated like a bath-robed piece of furniture. Ramon listened in silence, wearing that judge face he pulls on when he thinks. At the end, he said, It isn't illegal to pretend to be dead, but it's not advisable. Relax. I don't plan to make the news. I just want to teach them to value me without sermons. This is going to hurt them. Perfect, I said. Then they'll know how it hurt me. I left with a plan in my head and a fizzing in my chest. It wasn't fear, it was excitement. For the first time in a long while, I had something to do besides waiting for calls that never come. That night, while I made tea, I laughed to myself. I thought of my grandson, of his face when he discovered what I left him in the will. Not money, not the flat. Something better. A lesson he wouldn't forget even with therapy. I turned off the lights, sat by the window, and spoke softly. Damian, darling, looks like I'm going to do something interesting after all. He didn't answer, of course. But I could swear the hallway clock moved a little. Before I continue my story, I'm very curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from today and what time it is there. I'd love to read you in the comments, because this story, though it's mine, could be yours, or your mother's, or your grandmother's, or that strong woman we all take for granted until one day she disappears without warning. That night, closing the notebook, I knew there was no turning back. I'd started a new game, and this time, I made the rules. Tomorrow, I promised myself I'll begin my dress rehearsal for death. But first, a good rest. Because pretending to be dead, my dears, takes energy too. The next morning I woke with the feeling I'd signed a secret contract with myself. Not with the notary or with Ramon, no, with me. The air smelled of toast and opportunity, which is a strange aroma when you're 70 and your knees creak before the alarm. The house was silent, that silence of when nobody needs you for anything yet. And for the first time in a long time, I liked it. I started the day like any other. I put on the kettle, opened the living room window to let in the mild October light, and greeted the basil plant, half dead, but still fragrant. On the radio, they talked about an electricity price hike, and I thought, coffee in hand, let it go up. I'm going to start spending on me. Because that was the point. I'd spent too long thinking about others, what my children needed, what the grandkids expected, what the world said a woman my age should do. That very day, I began the dress rehearsal for my new life. It wasn't improvised, even if it looked that way. I'd spent years taking mental notes on how people behaved when they thought I was scatterbrained. That morning I decided to prove them right, exaggerate the clumsiness, trip over my own slippers, leave the keys in the fridge. I laughed to myself as I did it. It's incredible how fast the world stops seeing you when you pretend to be a bit off. I went down in an oversized coat, dragging an empty shopping trolley, and pretended to head to the market. I didn't need anything, but I wanted to observe. The building manager, Signora Puri, stopped me with that mix of pity and curiosity used by those who think they're immortal. "How are you, Teresa? They told me you had a lively dinner last night." "Bah, family," I answered. "They're good kids, only they think affection is proven with care homes." Puri laughed nervously. I knew that within an hour the whole building would know the old woman on the third floor was losing it. Perfect. It suited my plans. That morning I went to the administrative office, then to the bank. I closed the joint account I had with my son Julian. The girl at the counter, young, long nails, distracted gaze, asked for the reason. I said, "Hereditary distrust." She didn't get the joke, but she gave me the receipt. I felt almost childlike pleasure. At midday, when the sun hit the balcony, I dialed Ramon's number, the notary. "Still alive?" he said first, amused. "For the moment, yes," but discreetly I replied. "I need you to come to the house." At 5 on the dot, the bell rang. He brought a brown folder, a slightly crooked mustache, and that smell of cold coffee old civil servants carry. We sat at the dining table. I served tea. He took out his notepad. "So, what exactly do you want, Teresa?" "I want to vanish, but without the drama of a coffin. Just stop being useful to those who take advantage of me." Ramon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That sounds like a personal revolution. Call it what you like. You just help with the paperwork. I want to change the deed on the flat, but in a way they can't sell without me. And also, draft a new document. Another will? No, a manual, for invisible old women like me." While he wrote, I spoke as if narrating a movie. I told him I'd decided to fake frailty to see just how far they'd exploit it. That I'd leave false clues, forgotten documents on my table, loud conversations with supposed imaginary friends, messages on the answering machine for no one. And beneath that, a real plan. Move my life elsewhere without anyone noticing. Ramon looked at me with a mix of admiration and fright. "Teresa, you're staging a dangerous play." "Dear, after raising 2 kids, a husband, and an insolent grandson, danger just bores me. This is art." We laughed. It was a strange afternoon, a dash of conspiracy, a touch of recovered youth, as if time were giving me a second chance to misbehave. When Ramon left, I stayed alone in the house. I looked around. The photos, the furniture, the curtain my daughter hated. I thought each object was a witness to a version of me that no longer existed. I started filling boxes with things I didn't need, but instead of tossing them, I wrote a name and a sentence on each. On Julian's box, "So you remember your mother worked too." On Anna's, "For when you learn not to always be right." On Martine's, the grandson who shouted at me, I wrote only, "Surprise." The next day I went to the clinic. I wasn't sick, but I needed a paper. I asked the doctor for a report about my recent weakness and memory lapses. He looked at me with compassion. "You don't seem disoriented, Teresa." "That's the problem, doctor. If I were, I wouldn't notice. Do me the favor." I left with my signed paper and the certainty that the fiction was taking hold. That same afternoon, I ran into my daughter on the street. "Mom," the neighbor said she saw you arguing with the bank clerk. "Are you all right?" "Of course, dear. I just forgot my pin." She frowned, touched my arm as if it were glass. "Be careful, okay? I don't want anything to happen to you." I smiled, and in my head I thought, too late, it already did. I got lost to you years ago. Days passed. Each one was a scene from my rehearsal. I let myself unravel on purpose. Mismatched stockings, left the door ajar, burned a pan. Deep down, I enjoyed it. There was something liberating about not having to be perfect. One afternoon, my grandson Martin showed up. He came with a backpack and a tired face he didn't bother to hide. He stood in the hallway, uncomfortable. "Grandma, I came to see how you are." "Alive, to your misfortune." He blushed. He said nothing for a while. Then he pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures of his new bike, a girl, his gym. He didn't ask anything about me. He just talked. "Is something wrong?" I asked at last. "Nothing. But I'm sorry about the other day." "What day?" "When I yelled at you." "Ah, that. I don't even remember, son." At my age, insults last less than mint lozenges. He smiled, relieved, and gave me a quick hug. But in his eyes I saw guilt, or something like it. When he left, I felt a pang of tenderness, mixed with suspicion. I don't know if he apologized because he meant it, or because he sensed something moving under the rug. That night I wrote in the blue notebook, "To those who think I'm losing my mind, a warning. I'm using it for the first time." The following days I devoted to preparing my covert move. Ramon found me a temporary room in a small coastal town, a few hours from here. No one would know I'd gone. I left my house tidy, food in the fridge and clothes on the line, so it would look like I'd return any moment. I said goodbye to the neighbors with vague excuses. On the last day, as I closed the door, I felt a knot in my stomach. Not sadness, vertigo. Starting over at 70 sounds brave when someone else says it, but in your own skin, it's scary. Even so, I told myself I couldn't stay where I wasn't seen. I took a cab to the station. On the way, I looked out the window and thought about everything I was leaving behind. Sundays of baked rice, my husband's cologne, the familiar voices that no longer recognized me. But I also thought of what awaited me. Anonymity, freedom, something like justice. The train left on time. As the landscape slid by, I felt my heart pounding, as if my body suddenly remembered it was still alive. I took out my notebook and wrote, "First act complete. I am officially an invisible old woman." When I arrived in the town, the air smelled of sea and fresh bread. I walked to the boarding house Ramon had recommended. The owner, a short woman with a Galician lilt, eyed me curiously. "Long trip?" "No. Long life," I answered. She assigned me a small room with a balcony over the sea. I sat by the window, watching the slow-breaking waves, and knew the plan was only just beginning. That night, I fell asleep with the feeling I'd broken a spell. I was no longer the docile grandmother waiting at home for visitors. I was a woman pretending to be confused to unmask those who really were. Before turning out the light, I thought of my grandson and what was to come. I pictured his face when he learned his grandmother wasn't just good for cooking and caregiving, but also for disappearing and writing her own story. And I promised myself that when it was all over, if it ever ended, I'd give him something better than forgiveness, a lesson. The sea tapped the shore softly, and I smiled in the dark. I didn't know if what I was doing was madness or late wisdom, but it was mine, and for the first time in many years, that was enough. I woke before the sun, with the murmur of the sea coming through the window like someone breathing at my side. I lay there a while, watching the sky go from gray to pink, that moment when the day still hesitates between waking and sleeping in. I didn't have to think long. I got up, put water to boil, and with the first sip of coffee felt certain the rehearsal was over. Now the show began. The town still smelled of hot bread and the fishermen's damp nets. The boarding house had a gallery over the promenade, with worn wicker chairs that creaked like bones when you Saturday. I liked that sound. It reminded me the old can still hold weight. From there I could see the little kiosk where each morning a lady with a bun sold newspapers, gum, and conversation. I started going every day, not so much for the paper, I hardly read it, as because human contact, even in disguise, keeps you alive. I passed myself off as Lola, a widow from Valladolid who'd come to rest from the world. I made up a simple story, no flourishes, because lies that are too polished always smell odd. By the third visit, the kiosk lady was already offering me coffee from her thermos and telling me local gossip. No one suspected anything. It was a relief, and, at the same time, a small stab of loneliness, knowing I could erase my name so easily. Ramon called every 2 days from the city, using a tone that mixed admiration and worry. "Everything's going according to plan," he'd say, "but your kids are stirring. I went to the bank and they asked about you. They say you haven't answered for days." "Perfect," I'd reply. "Let them get uneasy. Love tends to wake up only when there's inheritance involved." "You're wicked, Teresa." "No, Ramon, I'm precise." Each call gave me a jolt of adrenaline. I hadn't had such a big secret since I used to sneak off with Damian to the neighborhood dances without telling my mother. I felt a kind of belated youth, as if the sea air were clearing not just my lungs, but the residue of submission stuck to me for decades. In the afternoons, when the sun dropped, I liked to walk the beach with a notebook in hand. There, I wrote my observations, thoughts, and ideas for what I was beginning to call, without irony, my resurrection. If you're going to die symbolically, you're entitled to a scripted return. In that notebook, I noted the steps for my next move, my own funeral. Not a sad one, of course. A rehearsal with spectators. I wanted to see how far they'd go faking grief after years of barely seeing me. I needed to check, out of pure psychological pleasure, whether the love they professed in public was as false as I suspected. So I called Ramon and asked him to help with a little trick. "I want you to spread the rumor I'm very ill," I said. "Something believable, but not fatal. A fall, confusion, whatever." And then, silence. A few weeks of mystery. And when they're scared enough, I disappear. And your house? Leave it as is. Make it look like I left without warning. Ramon sighed on the other end. "You don't want justice, Teresa. You want a spectacle." "Exactly. And there's nothing more just than watching them act in my own play." Days passed, and the rumor did its work. From a distance, Ramon told me the reactions. My daughter calling hospitals, my son asking at the police station, my grandson posting photos with me and sad quotes on social media. My grandmother, my example. He wrote the same one who shouted I was good for nothing. I read it aloud and nearly choked, laughing. That afternoon I wrote in the notebook, "Hypocrites always shine more at funerals than at birthdays." Meanwhile, in the town I started a new routine. Every morning I walked to the port and chatted with fishermen, tough, simple men who didn't ask much. I told them I was expecting a nephew's visit, he didn't exist, and that I wanted to rent a small flat by the sea. One of them, the oldest, recommended a modest, whitewashed house smelling of damp. I visited and knew at once it would be my refuge. It had a big window, a wooden table, and enough room for my plans. That night, sitting in the house, I opened the blue notebook on the table. I began to write my disappearance script. I structured it like a stage play, with acts, scenes, and directions. The first act was done, feign frailty. The second, underway, vanish subtly. The third, pending, resurrection. While I wrote, the boarding house phone, the only contact I'd left, rang. It was Ramon. "Teresa, it's getting out of hand. Your family reported you missing." "Perfect," I said without lifting my eyes. "Exactly what I wanted. But this is serious. The police called me. Even better, my funeral will have uniforms." He hung up grumbling, and I laughed till my belly hurt. Sometimes it scared me how much fun I was having. The following days were tense calm. On local TV, I saw small headlines about an elderly woman missing. No photo, just a vague description. Woman around 70, gray hair. Last seen at her home in the capital. I pictured my kids putting up posters and my grandson giving interviews feigning concern. Irony tasted sweet. I started noting everything for my future confession, because of course I planned to tell my story one day. It wasn't just revenge. It was a chronicle, proof that old age doesn't mean surrender. I wanted a record of every detail so that, when someone heard my voice in the future, they'd understand it wasn't madness, it was strategy. Each afternoon, in the harbor bar, the fishermen laughed with me. They told sea stories. I pretended to be just any woman. One of them, Manolo, asked what I wrote for so long. I said, "A diary, in case one day I forget who I was." "And if you don't forget?" he asked. "Then it'll help others remember." One night, while the wind battered the shutters, I felt a knot in my stomach. Not fear, nostalgia, the kind that arrives when the body remembers home even if the heart doesn't want to. I thought of my house, of the hallway clock that had stopped, of the ring of the phone that probably wouldn't sound again. It hurt a little, but not enough to regret. Next morning, I walked barefoot along the shore. The water was cold, sharp, but it did me good. I felt each step erase an old footprint, each wave carry off an unsaid word. I closed my eyes and saw my grandson's face, the sneer, the haughty voice. And I swear I didn't feel hatred, just pity. There are ages when arrogance is a kind of fear. Maybe there was still hope, I thought. Maybe this madness of mine could be a mirror for him. The following week, Ramon called again. "Teresa, your family wants to hold a mass in your honor. They say it's in case, well, you know, in case I really died." I laughed. "Let them. They can practice for when the time comes." "You're incorrigible." "No, Ramon, I'm free. And once you get used to freedom, guilt has no weight." I hung up and stared at the sea. That mass was just what I needed, my funeral rehearsal. I pictured the scene. Flowers, speeches, measured tears. The family united at last, but around my absence. And in that mental picture, I found myself smiling with an unfamiliar serenity. That night, I wrote in the notebook, "Dying isn't disappearing. Disappearing is ceasing to exist in the conversations of those you love. I'm already dead to them, only the formal burial is left." I fell asleep with that phrase echoing. And at dawn, when the first ray of sun entered the window, I knew the next step would be to attend my own funeral. Not with tears, of course, with a new dress and a well-placed smile. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to make sure that, at least for a day, they remembered I existed. And as I sat still, listening again to that constant sound of the sea that seems to repeat everything, I understood my revenge wasn't against them, but against their habit of writing me off. Maybe, after all, this plan wasn't an act of rebellion, but of love, a fierce love for myself which had taken 70 years to bloom. The sea kept breathing. I breathed with it, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that life, even dressed as death, could be delicious. The day of my own funeral dawned with insolent clarity, one of those mornings that seem to mock other people's pain. From the window of my house in the town, I watched the sea move slowly, with the arrogant calm of things that depend on no one. I made a strong coffee and thought that, deep down, there was something poetic about dying symbolically on a Tuesday, like Damian. Though he did it without warning, and I, on the contrary, had spent weeks rehearsing as if it were a play. The town buzz started early. They said the family of the missing lady was going to hold a mass in her memory. Ramon told me the news had leaked to the local paper, and even a small TV crew would come. That made me laugh. I, Teresa Roldan, retired housewife, turned Sunday spectacle. Not a bad idea. If they were going to invent me a death, let it at least be entertaining. Late morning I went for a walk along the promenade, dressed in black for the humor of it. No one knew me here, and that anonymity gave me a freedom I'd never had. I stopped at a souvenir shop and bought a fan with painted flowers. I snapped it open and closed as I walked, as if measuring with that gesture the exact distance between revenge and nostalgia. At midday, I called Ramon to go over details. "All set?" I asked. "Too much. Your kids are frantic. the grandkids posting sad quotes, and your son-in-law trying to contact lawyers. Perfect, I said. I want it to look like a magazine wake. Teresa, you're enjoying this too much. Why not? They've ignored me alive for years. Let me savor them dead with guilt. I hung up and made myself a light lunch. While I ate, the local radio broadcast a brief bulletin about the moving farewell to an exemplary woman. They didn't say my name, but described my neighborhood, my children, even mentioned my famous croquettes. Hearing it made me burst into a laugh so long it left me breathless. I thought maybe I should record it to play the day I actually die. At 5, Ramon messaged, "Mass starting. They're all here." I meanwhile sat facing the sea with a notebook and began writing my version of the facts. I imagined the scene with surgical precision: white flowers, measured tears, false hugs, whispers about the inheritance. I could even hear the exact phrases they'd be saying. "Poor Mom, such a good person. Yes, a shame. To think she lived alone, the flat should go to the grandkids, right?" And then I pictured Martin, the insolent grandson, speaking in a trembling voice at the altar. "My grandmother taught me to fight, to never give up. She was my example. And while he uttered those sweet lies, he'd surely be checking his phone in case his girlfriend texted." I wrote in the notebook, "Family theater always sells out, sold out crowd for my convenient dead mass." When the sun began to sink, the sky turned a dense orange. That color reminded me of sunsets in my city window, when I still expected someone to call and ask how I was. I stayed still, watching the waves break, and for the first time in a long while I felt a pang of real melancholy. Not for them, but for me, for the woman who endured so much silence without daring to rebel sooner. I decided to write a letter to Damian, not the first since his death, but the most honest. "My dear," I wrote, "you can't imagine how much fun this is. Faking my death is giving me back the urge to live. I don't know if where you are you can see what's happening here, but I promise your family is fit for a telenovela. Sometimes I think you'd look at me with tenderness. Other times you'd be scandalized. Doesn't matter. I'm doing this for me, not for them. Because it's time someone gives me back the worth I lost, taking care of everyone but myself." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with my notes. Outside, the church bells rang. My mass had ended. I pictured tense faces, air kisses, the conversations at the door. Ramon called minutes later. It just ended. His voice had a tremor I couldn't read. "Did they cry?" I asked. "A little. But the most impressive was your grandson. He gave a heartfelt speech, said he wished he could ask your forgiveness." I went silent. I hadn't expected that. "He really said that?" "Yes. He even left flowers at the altar. The expensive ones, I bet." "How generous," I answered with a half-smile. "If he'd bought them while I was alive, I'd have made him custom croquettes." We hung up. That night, I went to bed unsettled. I couldn't shake the image of Martin, the boy who'd yelled at me with contempt, now pretending remorse. Or maybe not pretending. Perhaps guilt had brushed something human in him. I fell asleep with that doubt. At the next dawn, the town returned to routine. But something in me changed. It wasn't just satisfaction or revenge. It was a kind of sly peace. I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. The fact of being secretly alive gave me an advantage no inheritance could match. From that anonymity, I could observe, decide, write my own version of the story. I got up early and went to the market. I bought fruit, bread, and a bottle of wine. At the flower stall, an older woman offered me white lilies. "They're for the deceased," she said. "Then I'll take them," I replied. "They're perfect for me." Back home, I found an envelope slid under the door. No sender. Inside, a folded sheet. "We know you're alive. Call me." No signature, just a phone number. I froze. For a few seconds, my heart hammered against my ribs. I thought of Ramon, but his handwriting wasn't that neat. Maybe the town journalist, the young man who'd seen me once having coffee on the promenade. Or, worse, someone from my family. I barely slept that night. The sea kept sounding, but it no longer calmed me. I sat on the bed with the note in my hands and wondered if it was time to face the consequences of my theater. Because every game, however clever, eventually hits its limit. In the morning, I called Ramon. "I have a problem." "What happened?" "Someone's discovered me." "Are you sure?" "I don't know who, but they left a note." "Are you going to call?" "Not yet. I need to think." "Be careful, Teresa. Secrets, when they grow, devour their keeper." "Don't worry, Ramon. If they find me, I'll pretend I'm my twin." I tried to joke, but underneath I was nervous. I went out to clear my head. On the promenade, the same journalist who'd wanted to interview me weeks earlier sat at a terrace. He saw me and raised his hand. "Lola," he called. "How's everything?" His smile disarmed me. I approached slowly. "Fine, son. Living." "Why?" "Because I swear you look a lot like a woman who was on the news." "One who disappeared recently." My stomach clenched, but I kept my composure. "Must be coincidence. All gray-haired old ladies look alike." He laughed, but curiosity lingered in his eyes. "You know, I'm preparing a piece on mysterious disappearances. It'd be interesting if you told me something, even if made up. You look like someone who knows stories." "I have stories, son, but some kill from boredom. The good ones always hide something." We said goodbye and I kept walking, but his phrase lingered. The good ones always hide something. Maybe he was right. I'd hidden too much and was beginning to feel the weight of so much shadow. That night I wrote in my notebook, "Anonymity is sweet until someone speaks your true name." I looked out the window. The moon lit the sea with a white, almost cruel light. I poured wine and thought of Martine, the mass, the flowers, the envelope at my door. I realized my story was no longer just mine. Somehow, everyone was starting to be part of this script, even those I'd wanted to leave out. The wind slipped through the gap and moved the curtain. I shut the window, took another sip, and made myself a promise. If anyone was going to uncover me, it would be on my terms. If they were going to write me an ending, I'd at least edit it first. And with that decision sounding like a dare, I turned off the light and let the sea keep speaking for me. The envelope with the note remained on the table, open, like a small wound you're not sure whether to clean or let bleed to see what happens. I looked at it each morning at breakfast with a blend of curiosity and fear that reminded me of stealing sweets from the corner store as a girl. Half the pleasure was the risk. I hadn't thrown it away, but I hadn't called either. It was a precarious balance, like everything I'd been doing lately, but it gave me a sense of control. Those days, I moved more cautiously around town. I greeted the fisherman and the kiosk lady as usual, but didn't linger. I looked over my shoulder more often and began to notice glances I hadn't before. I don't know if they were real or if fear was playing tricks, but the sense of absolute invisibility had cracked. Something or someone had set eyes on me. One afternoon, returning from the market, I saw a man leaning on the rail along the promenade, a notebook in his hand, a camera around his neck. I recognized him at once, the journalist, the kindly smiling boy who'd said good stories always hide something. He watched me openly. I walked slowly, pretending not to see, and when I passed, he spoke with that confident, curious tone of young people who think everyone wants to be discovered. "Lola, can I buy you a coffee?" "I have a proposal." I didn't answer at first. I stared at the sea, feigning indecision, then nodded with an exaggerated sigh, like I accepted from boredom and not fear. We sat on the terrace facing the beach, and he took out his notebook. "I'm preparing a story about families searching for missing people," he began. "There's one case that intrigues me. A woman from the city, Teresa Roldan." I felt the name like a shot. "And why does it intrigue you?" I asked, without looking at him. "Too many contradictions. The kids say one thing, the police another. And there's a blurry photo taken in this town of someone who looks a lot like you." I laughed, slowly, measuring each word. I didn't know I resembled a dead woman so much. "She's not dead," officially he corrected. "Just missing. Then tell her I'm alive." He raised his eyes from the notebook, surprised, searching my face for a crack to confirm his suspicion. but he found nothing. I learned long ago the best lie is told as truth, no drama, no blinking. Don't be upset, Lola, he said. I know there's more to your story, and I'd like to tell it right. The press always distorts. I want to hear your version. Mine would be boring, I replied. Lots of tea, little action. Maybe he smiled, but sometimes seemingly quiet lives hide the most interesting revolutions. We sat in silence a while, watching the waves. He took a photo without asking, and I didn't stop him. There was something about that apparent calm that worked for me. If I kept him close, I could control him. If I pushed him away, he might dig deeper. That night, writing in my notebook, I knew the game had changed. It was no longer just my experiment. Now there were witnesses, and witnesses always end up asking for truth. I wrote, I played with fire, and now I feel the smoke approach. But if I'm going to burn, let it be with light. I decided to call him the next day, not the number on the note, but the journalist. I set the meeting at the same cafe, pretending I wanted to clear a misunderstanding. When he arrived, he had the same notebook, the same look, and a small recorder he set on the table in plain sight. You can record, I said, but only if you promise not to publish without telling me. Of course. Perfect. Then listen, kid. I'm not Teresa Roldan. But I knew her. He frowned, intrigued. You knew her here? No. In the city. A while back. We crossed paths at church, I think. She was kind, a bit naive, with a complicated family. Do you know what happened to her? I know one day she decided to leave. Without permission, without goodbyes. And that, son, isn't something just anyone does. He fell quiet, scribbling fast, and I kept talking, improvising a parallel biography of myself. I mixed truths and lies with the precision of a seamstress sewing a dress from different fabrics. In the end, he looked at me with a kind of admiration. You have a cinematic way of telling things. Must be the age. By now I've lived so many lives I can pick the one that sounds best. We said goodbye with a handshake. As he left, he said, If you ever want to tell me more, I'll be around. I don't give up easily. And he smiled with a blend of respect and challenge. I went home with my heart racing. I felt I'd regained control, at least for a while. But when I opened the door, there was another envelope on the floor. Same paper, same neat handwriting. If you keep pretending, the family will learn the truth. This time the fear was clearer, more physical. My hands shook. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark. I spent the night awake, running through every step I'd taken. Who could know so much? Ramon alone had details, but I trusted him. Could it be someone in town who recognized me on TV? Or maybe Martin, my grandson, the only one with the instincts to track social media and clues? The thought raised my hackles. I pictured his face if he saw me alive, his mix of anger and relief. I didn't know if he'd want to hug me or kill me. The next morning I refused to be paralyzed. The best defense was to keep acting. I went to the harbor, greeted as usual, bought bread, smiled at the kiosk lady. No one noticed anything. But inside, fear prowled like a restless animal. That afternoon I called Ramon. I have a serious problem, I said bluntly. Someone's following me. Are you sure? Yes. And someone's leaving notes. Listen, Teresa, if this gets complicated, you have to stop. And do what? Go back to square one? Let them put me in a home and take my house? No, Ramon. It's too late to give up. And if they find you out? Then I'll improvise. I've always been good at theater. I hung up and stared at the phone. I felt everything moving toward a point of no return, but I didn't know which. I started to write, almost furiously, filling pages with thoughts, memories, confessions. Not out of fear of forgetting, but from the need to leave a record. If someone ever found those notebooks, I wanted them to understand my disappearance was an act of freedom, not madness. When night fell, the wind picked up. I shut the windows, but the sea's sound still slipped in, like insistent breath. I poured wine and lit a candle. Its flame trembled with the same rhythm as the fear I refused to admit. I thought of Martin again. I couldn't get him out of my head. What if he'd really changed? What if, somehow, this lesson was working? I let myself imagine him looking for me, repentant, eyes wet and pride broken. For some reason, the image soothed me. I decided to play back. I took a sheet and wrote, "Firm hand. If you know who I am, tell me what you want. But if what you want is truth, you'll have to come for it in person." I folded it and left it where the last envelope had appeared under the door. I went to bed with the feeling of flipping a coin in the air. And in that uncertainty I fell asleep, imagining two possible futures. One where they discovered me and the scandal devoured me, and another where I remained gone until time, as always, erased the footprints. At dawn, the note was gone. I stepped onto the balcony. The sea was the same, indifferent, but I wasn't. For the first time since this began, I felt the plan slipping from my hands. Yet despite the tension, part of me refused to regret it. Maybe that's what I'd been after without knowing. To feel alive, even in danger. Because sometimes, after years dimmed, fear can feel like a kind of light. I poured another coffee, breathed deep, and opened the notebook. I wrote slowly, "Freedom has a price, and I'm ready to pay it." I don't remember how long I sat still after seeing the note was gone. I think it was hours, because the sun shifted and the smell of cold coffee mixed with the salt sneaking through the window crack. I felt like I was living inside a film, only without a director, without a script, and with the certainty that any scene could be the last one I controlled. Deep down, I was afraid, but the kind that also wakes something like excitement. That morning I went down to the promenade earlier than usual, with the intent to watch. I didn't know whom, but I felt someone was watching me, that someone had crossed the line of anonymity where I felt safe. I bought the paper, pretended to read it, and sat at a terrace. On the front page, a black and white photo of my family smiling in front of the church. The headline said, "Search continues for Teresa Roldan, missing for a month." I shivered. Below the photo, the article described their loved one's pain and a possible lead on the Mediterranean coast. It was signed by the young journalist, the same who had invited me for coffee. I closed the paper slowly, folded it like a letter, and asked for the check without looking at anyone. I walked home through side streets, dodging glances, convinced he knew exactly who I was and was toying with me. In my room, I laid the paper on the table and studied the family photo. My son's face was taut, my daughter's expression camera perfect, and my grandson Martin in the center, holding a candle and smiling with rehearsed pain. And though it angered me, something inside softened, the first crack of tenderness in all that theater. I spent the following days writing and thinking what to do. I couldn't leave town overnight, that would raise suspicion, but I couldn't stay idle either. Ramon called twice, uneasy, telling me journalists were poking around my neighborhood, that some neighbors swore they'd seen me on a train. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. "Nothing. That you'd gone to a spa, but I doubt they believed me." "Let them doubt," I said. "Doubt is the only place I can still breathe." That weekend, the town filled with tourists. People in hats, kids shouting, ice creams melting on hot pavement. I hid at home, blinds half down, going over the latest letters and the will documents Ramon had drawn up before my flight. Among the papers, I found a clause I'd almost forgotten, the condition forcing my heirs to carry out a public act of goodwill to access the inheritance. I read it 3 times and smiled. Maybe it was time to use it. In the afternoon, I called Ramon. "Remember that clause in the will?" I said. "The one about acts of goodwill." "Of course. It was your idea. Perfect. I want to trigger it." "How?" "Send a copy to my children with an anonymous message. Tell them if they truly want to honor my memory, they must fulfill that condition by month's end." "Isn't that risky?" "Yes, but fun. And I need to distract them, let them chase one shadow while I think what to do about the other." Ramon agreed, resigned. Deep down, I think he was enjoying his role, the reluctant accomplice to a rebel widow. A week later, I saw the consequences in the papers. A photo of my daughter launching a recycling campaign, my son delivering food at a charity, And Martin, the grandson, who shouted at me hugging dogs at a shelter and telling cameras that this is how he honored his grandmother's legacy. I stared at him, half laughing and incredulous. The boy had a talent for acting, that's for sure. I wondered if somewhere in his face there was anything real, something beyond public posturing. That evening, the journalist crossed my path again. I was walking the promenade when he appeared, camera in hand, staring pensively at the sea. "Lola," he said when he recognized me, "the Teresa Roldan story is taking a stunning turn. Looks like her family's doing some collective tribute." "How lovely," I said, with irony so subtle he missed it. "But it's curious," he added. "An anonymous source sent them a message with conditions to inherit, almost like a bad joke. Or a final lesson," I replied. "Do you think someone can plan such a thing after dying?" "There are no limits when someone feels invisible," I said. He stayed quiet a few seconds and then looked at me carefully. "You know, Lola, sometimes I think you and that Teresa have a lot in common." "We all have something in common with ghosts," I answered. I waved and kept walking. I knew his suspicions were growing, but as long as he doubted, I was safe. That night, though, I found another envelope under the door. It only said, "Every lie has its price." Same handwriting. I felt a deep weariness, like my body weighed more than my conscience. The next day, I decided to write directly to Martin. Not to reveal myself, but to test him. I took a fresh sheet from my notebook and wrote, "Dear grandson, my name is Lola, and I've followed your story on TV. I've seen how you speak of your grandmother with such affection, and though I didn't know her, something in your words made me think. Sometimes, love arrives late, but it arrives. Take care of that good part you're discovering, because if you lose it, nothing else will matter." I signed only L. I put the letter in an envelope and mailed it to the animal shelter where he worked. No return address. It was an impulse, a small madness within the big one. Several days passed with no reply, until one morning, opening the boarding house mailbox, I found a letter addressed to Lola. It was from him. I recognized his handwriting because, although he never wrote me, I'd seen it 1,000 times in notes left on my table when he lived with me, the ones that said, "Not having dinner," or "I took money from your purse. I'll pay you back later." The letter was brief. "Thank you for your message. I don't know why, but it made me think of my grandmother. Sometimes I dream of her. If you see her, even in heaven, tell her I miss her." I cried. Not much, but enough to blot a page of the notebook. There was a new tenderness in those words, a small but real crack in the armor of indifference. Maybe, without knowing it, it was working. Maybe my disappearance was doing more for him than all the words I'd said in life. That night, while the sea roared louder than usual, I wrote, "Presence isn't always required to teach. Sometimes absence educates better than 1,000 speeches." The calm didn't last. 2 days later, Ramon called, agitated. "Teresa, you need to listen. Rumor is the police will reopen the case. They say they received a new tip." "What tip?" "A letter, anonymous. Someone claims you're alive and living in this town." I was speechless. It couldn't be the journalist, he didn't know enough. And Martin? No, not him. Who then? "You must decide what to do," Ramon went on. "Either disappear completely or come back before this turns on you." "Not yet," I said after a long silence. "I'm not done." I didn't sleep that night. I went out to the balcony and stared into the dark, listening to the wind batter the shutters. I felt the circle closing, the game nearing its end, and wondered if I had the strength to play the final act. The moon etched a trembling line on the sea, and in that tremor I recognized my own pulse. I knew soon someone would knock on my door, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted it to be the journalist, the police, or my own grandson. But I also knew that, whatever happened, I was no longer the woman who let herself be humiliated at her own table. If the price of getting my voice back was being found out, I'd pay gladly. And as the clock struck 3 in the morning, I wrote the day's last line. "When they find me, if they do, may they know it wasn't escape, it was return." That morning dawned murkier than usual, as if the sky knew something had broken and preferred not to shine too much light. The sea was churning, waves crashing against the rocks with a violence I hadn't felt in weeks, and every sound seemed like an omen. I woke before 6, mind crowded with fragments. Martine's letter, Ramon's warning, the anonymous notes, the journalist, the police. All mixed, as if fate had shuffled my lies and now dealt the cards out of order. I rose without switching on the light, made coffee, and sat by the open window. The air smelled of salt and storm. I thought that if my story ended there, at least it would be on a worthy stage. I closed my eyes a moment and listened to the sea's roar, that sound that had accompanied me since I began this farce. I wondered if I'd ever truly wanted to disappear, or if what I sought was exactly this, for someone to look for me with real intent, not out of duty or obligation. The phone rang at 7 sharp. It was Ramon. His voice was taut, no frills. "Teresa, I told you the police are close. They're going to sweep the area. There's a recent photo of you, taken on the promenade." "Photo?" "Yes." A contact showed me. Blurry, but clearly you. The journalist took it, the one circling you. I felt a jab of anger and fatigue at once. "Then that's that," I said. "Game over. What will you do?" "I don't know, Ramon. Maybe improvise a final exit, like in good dramas." I hung up and stared at the phone. Improvisation was all I had left. I'd spent weeks scripting my life, but I hadn't planned for such an abrupt ending. And yet, there was something freeing about letting go of control. I decided to walk. The sky was gray, heavy with humidity, and the wind lifted the skirts of the waves. The town looked different, smaller, more alien. I wandered until I reached the harbor, where fishermen gathered their nets before the storm dragged them out. They greeted me as usual, and one Manolo offered coffee. "A big one's coming, Lola," he said. "Better stay under a roof." "Sometimes you need to watch the storm up close," I replied. I returned home with my heart racing, though I didn't know if from the wind or from the decision taking shape in my head. I turned on the radio and heard local news. The police were looking for new leads on my disappearance. They said there were indications I was alive. They even mentioned an anonymous call claiming to have seen me in this very town. I changed stations, but they all repeated my name. Teresa Roldan was news again. I stood before the mirror, watching the woman reflected back. Whiter hair, deeper wrinkles, but also a light in the eyes I didn't remember from before. It wasn't fear I saw, but a kind of acceptance, a gentle weariness. I thought of Damian and how he always said you have to decide when to stop hiding. Maybe he was right. Late morning I heard footsteps in the boarding house hall. I peeked and saw a shadow stop at my door. Soft knocks 3. I waited a few seconds. When I opened, it was him, the journalist. A folder under his arm, rain-soaked coat. He looked at me with a mix of triumph and respect. "I knew it was you," he said. "You can't have it all in life, kid. Not anonymity and fame." He came in without being invited. He stood, dripping on the floor, and pulled a photograph from the folder. Me, walking by the sea, fan in hand. "Why pretend to be dead?" he asked. "Because dead, they paid attention to me," I answered, bluntly. He didn't speak at first. He watched me as if trying to understand or to judge. "I don't know." Then he lowered his gaze and spoke more softly. "Do you know what will happen when I publish this?" "Of course. But I also know what happens if you don't. No one learns anything. And your family? They've learned more from my absence than in a lifetime of my presence." He sighed. "I don't want to hurt you." "You already did," I said. "But I don't blame you. Everyone follows their instinct. Yours as a journalist, mine as a ghost." We were silent a while. Then he asked if he could record our conversation. I agreed, on one condition. "Promise me I get the last word." "Deal." He switched on the recorder. Full name, Teresa Roldan. Age, 70 years and 1 month of freedom. Reason for your disappearance? Tiredness. Of noise, of disdain, of the habit of being invisible. I wanted to know what would happen if one day I wasn't there. And what happened? Nothing at first, then everything. I discovered who faked affection, who truly missed me, and who only remembered me for the value of my flat. He listened with respect. His eyes, once curious, now seemed sad. You know the police will come for you? Let them. I haven't committed a crime. Faking my death isn't punishable. Faking love is, but no one punishes that. When he turned off the recorder, he looked at me a long while. I don't know whether to admire your courage or be afraid of it, he said. Same thing, son. Well-managed fear is just courage in costume. I offered tea, and he accepted. We sat by the window, watching the agitated sea. We spoke little. When he left, he forgot the recorder on the table. He said he'd come for it the next day. That night, with the storm beating the walls, I listened to my own voice on the recorder. I was surprised to hear myself so firm, so sure, as if the woman speaking wasn't me but someone who'd waited a lifetime to say those lines. I realized that, for the first time, I didn't sound old. I sounded alive. At dawn, a loud knock at the door jolted me. 2 plainclothes men. They showed badges without many words. Mrs. Roldan? One asked. Depends on the day, I said. We need you to come with us. This early? Not even a coffee? They didn't laugh. They took me to a car. Not an arrest, I could tell by the tone, but something like closure. On the way, one explained they needed to clarify the circumstances of my disappearance, that my family was desperate. I looked out the window, the sea receding, and wondered whether I deserved that word. At the station, Ramon was waiting. He had an insomniac's face and trembling hands. I told you this would end badly, he whispered. It hasn't ended yet, I said. The finale's missing. The interview was brief. I told them I left by choice, suffered no harm, and didn't want to press charges against anyone. I asked for an hour alone before my family arrived. They granted it. Ramon stayed with me in a small, windowless room. What will you do now? He asked. Go back. But on my terms, they won't understand. They never did. It's fine. I'm not asking to be understood, just to be heard once without interruption. At noon, I saw them arrive, my daughter, my son, and behind them, Martine. They came in with faces tense, surprised, relieved, all at once. They looked at me as if unsure whether to hug or reproach. I said nothing. It was my grandson who broke the silence. Grandma, you're alive. More than you think, son. And for the first time in a long time, I hugged him without irony. I felt his body rigid at first, then soft, as if something dissolved between us. I whispered in his ear, sometimes you have to disappear to be seen. I didn't cry, neither did they. But in that room, at last, the air turned human. That night, when they let me return to my house in town, I wrote in the Tom Today 4 notebook, every story needs a storm to clear the air. Mine has passed. Now comes picking up the pieces and deciding what deserves rebuilding. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and slept to the sound of the sea, no longer roaring, just breathing, calm, as if it too awaited the next act. The morning after I returned to the town dawned with a strange light, as if the sun were eyeing me cautiously, undecided whether to celebrate or scold my return. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly washed clothes, that domestic scent that once soothed me and now tasted like a threat. I sat a long time at the open window, watching the calm sea, feeling the slow breath of the waves, trying to remember what one is supposed to feel after being resurrected. Not joy, not fear. What I felt was deep fatigue, a clean emptiness, like after a move when you sit on the floor, unsure whether the house is yours or someone else's. Ramon came mid-morning. Same rumpled jacket as always, mustache a bit askew, an expression between guilt and relief. I expected you later, I said, not getting up from the chair. I couldn't leave without making sure you were all right. I'm alive. That's enough. That doesn't answer my question. Then no, I'm not all right, but no worse than before. He was quiet a while, fingers fidgeting on the hat he held. Your family wants to see you, he said at last. They say they're willing to talk without reproaches. Talk without reproaches. What a pretty, unlikely phrase. Martine defended you. I heard him. He said if you faked your death, you must have had your reasons. Ah, the grandson. Always late, but at least he arrives. Ramon smiled. Want me to arrange something? Yes. A meal. Here, at the house. No cameras, no journalists, no speeches. Just them and me. And if they don't come, they'll come. Curiosity beats resentment. He nodded and promised to handle it. When he left, silence took over again. I spent the afternoon cleaning the house with obsessive care, as if scrubbing, dusting, tidying, and putting fresh flowers were a way to tidy what was inside me too. Sometimes I stopped, cloth in hand, and thought of Damian, of how he would have enjoyed seeing me back on my feet, in charge. Maybe he'd laugh at my theatricality, or maybe he'd be proud. I don't know. All I know is, in that moment, I wished I could tell him everything from Martine's insult to the journalist's recorder. Lunch would be Sunday, 3 days later. In those days, the town watched me discreetly. No one dared ask me anything directly, but I felt the glances, the murmurs. To them, I was the mad woman who'd faked her death. In part I was, and I didn't mind. Worse would have been to keep being the invisible old woman. Sunday dawned clear, the sky so bright it hurt. I made a meat stew, opened a bottle of wine, and set the table on the porch facing the sea. I didn't know if I did it out of courtesy or strategy. At noon sharp I heard a car engine up the hill. Sunlight flashed off the windshield, and a knot tightened in my stomach, a mix of anticipation and fear. Out stepped my daughter Anna, my son Julian, and Martine. They wore neutral colors, as if the black of the fake death still clung to them and they didn't dare dress in joy. I watched them come up the path, hesitant, stumbling on stones, as if afraid to arrive. When they stood before me, there were no hugs, no tears, just thick silence. I spoke first. If you're expecting explanations, you'll have to sit. This will take a while. They sat in a row, like school children being scolded. Martine looked at me with a mix of guilt and fascination. I knew that arrogant boy no longer existed entirely. There was something new in his gaze, not just remorse, respect. I won't apologize for what I did, I said slowly, because I did it in full consciousness. I pretended to die because I needed to know if there was any love left in this family or only interest. And I'm glad to say I found a little of everything. Anna frowned. Do you think what you did is normal, Mom? You made us suffer, you made your grandson suffer. Temporary suffering, nothing a little truth can't cure. Julian cut in, tired tone. You made us all look ridiculous, you know? The neighborhood, the police, the press. Reputation is a luxury for the living who don't know themselves, I replied. I simply did a cleaning. Martine looked straight at me. I insulted you, he said softly. I know. I don't want to justify it, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? I asked. Of watching you age, of not knowing what to do with you, of not being the grandson you needed. I didn't need a perfect grandson, just one who didn't treat me like I was extra. I know, he said, eyes wetting. I was wrong. Silence returned, softer this time. I took a deep breath and felt something loosen inside, a taut rope finally giving way. Well, I said at last, at least one of you gets it. Now eat, the stew's getting cold. We ate without much talk. The clink of cutlery and the wind through the geraniums were the only music. There was something almost sacred in that calm. When we finished, I took an envelope from my pocket and set it on the table. Here's the new will, I announced. Don't panic. This time it's legal and final. Anna took it with trembling hands. What did you do now? Nothing you don't deserve. The money from the flat will go to a fund for neighborhood youth, those without a grandma or a home. As for you, I'm leaving you something far more useful. Work. If you want any part of the inheritance, you'll have to collaborate with the project for a year. Unpaid. Just work. Julian huffed. Anna's eyes flew wide. And Martine? Martine smiled. Seems fair, he said. I expected nothing less, I replied. The sea murmured softly behind us, as if approving deal. Ramon, who had arrived without us noticing, came over and tapped my shoulder lightly. All in order, he whispered. It's filed. No one can contest it. Perfect. Then, let the second part of this story begin. Anna stood up, indignant. Mom, this is madness. No, dear, this is justice. And I warn you that justice, when late, tends to show up dressed as revenge. Julian said nothing. He took his sister's hand and led her to the car. Martin stayed. He came closer, like not wanting to break something fragile, and hugged me hard. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for starting to be someone for yourself, I answered. When they left, silence filled everything again. But it was no longer a solitude silence. It was rest. I sat once more on the porch, watching the sea. Ramon stayed a while. And now, what will you do? He asked. Live, I replied. Without pretending, without waiting, without apologizing for staying alive. He nodded, stood, and left without another word. I remained, with the sea's sound behind me, the tablecloth still stained with wine, and the certainty that, for the first time in many years, I owed no one an explanation. I looked at the sky and saw a gull gliding over the water, free, with no apparent course. That night, I wrote in the notebook, sometimes you have to die a little, so they let you live. I faked my death to remind them I was alive, but in the end, the only one who needed reminding was me. I stared at that sentence a long time, until the ink dried and tiredness won. Outside, the sea kept breathing, serene, as if at last it understood it no longer had to roar to make me listen. The following days were strangely calm, a calm that almost scared me, as if the world were holding its breath before making me pay for everything I'd done. I woke early, without an alarm, and spent mornings on the porch with coffee. The sea stretched before me, silent, obedient, complicit. Sometimes I thought the sea was the only one who'd understood from the start. I didn't want revenge, punishment, or attention. I simply wanted to exist with dignity, without asking permission to breathe. Ramon visited often. He said it was duty, but his smile betrayed him. He enjoyed seeing how my little domestic revolution had unsettled the family order without breaking it. You've got them in check, he said. Not easy at 70. I told him it wasn't check, but reset a word I liked because it sounded like an old machine working again after years of useless noise. My daughter Anna didn't call again, but I heard from Ramon that she'd started helping with the project I'd imposed. My son Julian, on the other hand, wrote a short, almost bureaucratic letter thanking me for the chance to repair ties. I read it 3 times and then kept it without replying. It wasn't that I didn't care. It's that, for the first time, I wanted them to insist. I'd always been the one to mend, to call, to bridge, and I was tired of being the only one building roads while others crossed them without looking. Martin, however, came almost every weekend. He arrived with a backpack, unannounced, with that sweet awkwardness of someone trying to do right and not knowing how to start. The first time he showed up with a bunch of wildflowers from the roadside, and I pretended not to be moved, though I put them in water immediately. The second time, he brought a new notebook. So you keep writing, he said. After that, he'd sit for hours on the porch, watching the sea with me. Sometimes we talked, sometimes not. And that shared silence was more conversation than any words. One afternoon, over coffee, he asked if I'd ever thought about publishing my writing. Publishing? I laughed. Who'd want to read the memoir of an old woman who faked her death? Plenty, he said. Everyone who feels invisible, everyone who ever thought of disappearing without doing it. I don't know how to write for others, Martin. What I put there is just for me. Maybe it's time to share, he said with a seriousness I didn't know in him. Sometimes telling the truth helps more than hiding it. I looked at his face, that blend of youth and guilt, and understood he meant it. Maybe he was right. Maybe my story could help someone not as example but caution. But I still wasn't ready. It still hurt too much to face myself. That night, after he left, I opened the notebook and read everything I'd written since the start. I was surprised at the coherence of my own words, as if part of me had been narrating without the other knowing. There was irony, pain, tenderness, even humor. I found myself laughing at passages I'd written, crying. Maybe writing is that, a mirror that distorts just enough so you can bear what you see. Days grew long and serene. I cooked for myself, walked the beach, greeted neighbors without feeling the weight of their stares. Some still whispered behind my back, of course, but I didn't care anymore. Somehow, I'd learned other people's opinions are just noise once you've heard your own voice. One midday, I received an unexpected letter. No sender, but I recognized the handwriting. The journalist. "Dear Teresa," it began. "I decided not to publish anything, not because it isn't extraordinary, but because I understood some truths belong only to those who live them. If you ever change your mind, I'll help you tell it. I promise." I read it several times, each time surprised by the tenderness it stirred. I thought that, in his way, he'd learned something too. That same afternoon, Martin came again. I saw him from the window and noticed a new look in his eyes, decision mixed with fear. He came in without waiting, as he did now. "Grandma, I need to tell you something," he said, voice trembling. "If it takes less than 2 sentences, better, my coffee's getting cold." "It was me," he blurted. "I sent the anonymous letter to the police." I looked at him without speaking. For a second, I didn't understand. Then everything clicked. The notes, the false lead, the reappearance. I sat still, watching guilt dissolve his face. "I did it because I was scared something really had happened to you," he went on. "And also because I wanted to find you, and you needed the police for that? I didn't know how else. I thought if they looked, you'd show up. And it worked, didn't it?" I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Deep down, there was a desperate tenderness in his confession. He hadn't wanted to destroy my plan. He wanted to understand, to be part of it, to fix something. "You're just like your grandfather," I said at last, "always thinking problems get solved with noise." "I'm sorry, Grandma. Don't ask forgiveness. It's done. This had to end somehow, and if it had to be like this, I prefer it was you who closed the circle." He breathed easier, but a knot remained in my chest. Not anger, awareness. Everything I'd done, all my theater, had dragged him in as well, in his way. I looked at him with a mix of pride and melancholy. "You know," I said, "maybe you're the only inheritance worth leaving." We fell silent. The sea turned golden with the falling afternoon. He took my hand, and in that simple gesture, the years of distance, insults, and guilt unraveled. At last, I felt something close with gentleness. That night I wrote, "Sometimes justice shows up dressed as a grandson, and forgiveness, though late, has the warm touch of a young hand on an old one." The next days passed with almost kind slowness. Martin kept coming. Ramon brought papers to close things legally, and I walked the town without hiding. People no longer looked with curiosity, but with a mix of respect and wariness. Some greeted with short phrases, others with a nod. I returned the greeting, but inside I laughed. I'd achieved the impossible, becoming a legend without dying. One afternoon, another letter arrived, this time from my daughter. No rancor, just weariness. "I don't know if I can forgive you entirely, Mom, but I understand what you did. I suppose we all need to disappear in our own way." The letter ended with a line that made me cry. "If you ever feel like faking another death, tell me first. I want to say goodbye properly." I kept it with Martin's and the journalists. The 3 letters were, in essence, parts of the same story. 3 versions of a redemption nobody asked for, but that came anyway. That night the sea was calm, almost still. I sat on the porch with a glass of wine and my blue notebook on my lap. I opened to the first page, the one I wrote that day after the insult, and read, "My grandson yelled that I'm good for nothing, so I'm going to be good for something real." I smiled. I'd done it. I'd been good for something. I wrote one last line on the inside back cover. "If one day I disappear again, don't look for me. Next time it'll be only to rest, not to teach." And I closed the notebook. The wind blew soft, the wine was warm, and the sea breathed slowly. Somewhere on the horizon the lighthouse lit, guiding boats that hadn't yet found port. I watched it a long time, feeling that, in some way, that light was mine too. Because though I'd spent a lifetime trying to be seen, Only then, in the quiet of my 70s, did I understand it was never about others looking at me. It was about learning to look at myself. And so, as the night closed around me and the sea returned my reflection, I knew my story had finally reached harbor. And that's where my story ends. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you feel listening to it? Tell me in the comments and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, because I still have plenty to say.